Right, let's get stuck into the Sunday papers with Chief Political Correspondent of The Times, Aubrey Allegretti. Lovely to see you, Aubrey. Thanks for coming in this morning.
Good morning.
Right, let's talk about Rachel Reeves. We've got her writing an op-ed in the Mail on Sunday talking about growth being the big Labour agenda. I mean, they are literally gambling the whole house on growth. I can't find much in her opinion piece about how they're actually going to achieve it beyond this wealth fund. I mean, what's your analysis of what she's saying about the economy and what they can do?
Well, she's obviously only a few weeks into the job, but Rachel Reeves is having to grapple with some quite difficult decisions. I think the Labour understand now that they're not in opposition. They can't sort of snipe from the sidelines. They do have to make tough decisions, and there are trade-offs. And I remember back in November 2022, when Jeremy Hunt was Chancellor, he was echoing Nigel Lawson's call for a sort of big bang reset to kind of try and unshackle the banks, some deregulation, try and pump some money into the system. You know, it didn't necessarily work. So she's going to find it very tough, I think, coming into the Treasury, with lots of calls already for her to boost public sector pay. We know the independent pay review bodies are coming out in the next week or so. So, yeah, there's a lot of pressure on her, and she's going to have to try and finally balance sort of being a new broom who comes in, brings optimism and gives people hope and that they feel like there's a new government without sort of actually giving very much away.
Labour seem to have put aside enough money to pay NHS workers and teachers, I think, 3% pay rise. They are asking, or at least the independent pay review body has recommended they give 5.5. It's almost the first test for Labour, isn't it? Because obviously, if they concede to those demands, the question will be asked of them, well, are you just always going to be sort of slaves to the unions, calling for more and more money? You've got Wes Streeting trying to negotiate with junior doctors who wanted 35%. Inflation's come down. They don't want it to go back up. And as the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, has pointed out this morning, you know, how are you going to pay for this? You've said you won't borrow more outside of very strict fiscal rules. You've said you won't tax working people more. And you don't want to be cutting government departments because then that will seem like it's austerity 2.0.
Yeah, exactly. She's going to have to really sort of finely balance this decision. I mean, when we were on the plane with Keir Starmer going to the NATO summit last week, I asked him about the issue of public sector pay. Are you going to give the unions what they want? And he was very categorical, no. So the independent pay review body structure is helpful for the government in that it's not sort of unions that make the decisions. Yeah. It's an independent body, and so they spend their time reporting. We know the outcome of, I think, 2 out of the 8 bodies for teachers and some NHS staff. There are still 6 more, but they're sort of around the 5.5% mark. Now, as you say, Labour had earmarked about 3%, and there's supposed to be this black hole of around £8 billion. So how Labour are going to fill it, they will have to sort of make that clear in the run-up to the budget in the autumn. Those are probably where we're going to see things like the sort of rise on VAT for private schools. Yeah. So other areas where they might start to increase taxes in order to claw back that money.
Let's move on to Lucy Letby, because she features in quite a lot of coverage in the Sunday papers this morning. We've got a Sunday Telegraph piece suggesting that nurses and doctors who wanted to support Letby in court and beyond were sort of gagged by the NHS. That's one set of allegations. Then this really interesting story about David Davis, the former Brexit secretary, who has taken up individual sort of causes where he's seen that there may be a miscarriage of justice taking place. Nobody at the moment, by the way, Aubrey, seems to be suggesting categorically that Lucy Letby could be innocent. They're saying that the evidence that was used to convict her could be shakier than we thought. What do you make of David Davis getting involved in this? Because it's risky for him, isn't it, for his reputation, if actually she's banged to rights. And she, let's not forget, she's been found guilty of killing 7 babies, of attempting to kill 7 others. She tried to appeal. That was roundly rejected.
So absolutely, I think, you know, David Davis is a very respected sort of civil rights campaigner, and he says that at the very least this appears to be a mistrial. So, you know, I think she's got some support from a prominent politician like him. And, of course, his position means that he can sort of help her in a way that lots of other people can't. He has parliamentary privilege, which means he can say things in the House of Commons. He can ask questions, and those are sort of covered by privilege. So she'll certainly be very sort of supported, I think, by this intervention. There is a degree of, I think, introspection in the wake of the Andrew Malkinson case. Yes. And people just very tetchy about wanting to...
Just explain that, because people might not be familiar with Malkinson.
Of course. So he was a man who was wrongly convicted of rape in 2004 and I think spent 17 years in prison. So obviously nobody is suggesting sort of huge similarities between the two cases, but that having come so recently, there are people looking at this and saying, does the criminal justice system look at itself and can it be held accountable in the right points and in the right way? And that's what I suppose the issue is here.
Aubrey, you mentioned that you covered the NATO summit, so you would have seen Joe Biden up close and personal. Lots of coverage today about him refusing to step down. He's been tapped on the shoulder by Barack Obama. He's been tapped on the shoulder, it seems, by Nancy Pelosi. He's hanging tough, saying no. How did you find him at the NATO summit? I understand you were in the room, you were in the Oval Office when he met with Keir Starmer. How did he seem?
So he was pretty on good form in the Oval Office, and during their private meeting, that's the same way that Keir Starmer sort of described him. He was quite sort of relaxed. He made some jokes. We asked him questions about the football and coming home, which might not sort of be immediately apparent what we were talking about to the US president. He didn't seem confused by that at all. But certainly later in the day, when he made the huge gaffe about calling President Zelensky President Putin instead, there suddenly erupted this kind of fire in his belly where during the press conference he seemed to get sort of increasingly wound up and frustrated with, I think, what he felt was the really mounting pressure around him because the NATO summit was this big moment where all the world leaders gathered in Washington and it was being completely undermined and overshadowed by questions about his leadership. And that, I think, the fear of it being taken away from him was the moment where he really started to kind of come out fighting. But it seems now increasingly more and more senior Democrats said, well, let him have his sort of moment, you know, hosting the summit. We don't want to overshadow that. But I think now they realise there's a small window where now the Republicans have picked their nominee. They have around a month or maybe 2-3 weeks until the Democrats do the same. So if they're going to do it, they probably need Biden's buy-in, not least because of the monetary transfer. If you want to be able to sort of give all of the proceeds of your donations to a successor, you can only do it on the Biden-Harris ticket. So it's either going to have to be Kamala Harris or...
It's interesting because he seemed to kind of open the door to standing down in that interview that he did in America where he said, well, if medical circumstances meant that I would have to stand down. And I thought, oh, hang on, is this a change of tone? But now we're just seeing him digging his heels in. One to watch, and we obviously will be doing that on GB News. And then let's finally talk about the Sunday Telegraph story. Expenses cheats and sex offender MPs in line for taxpayer-funded pensions. I'd imagine that people watching and listening to this will be outraged by the idea of MPs, for instance, like Charlie Elphicke, Imran Ahmed Khan, who have both spent time in prison, then ending up with taxpayer-funded pensions. Elphicke in line for 22 grand a year. Imran Ahmed Khan is for less, £3,000. But still, Aubrey, what do you think?
It is quite shocking. I mean, I think people are remiss to sort of tamper with pensions because they're what we sort of rely on when we get into old age and retirement. But in these cases, there are people who have been jailed for offences, and the Commons is out of step with other public sector organisations, the Met, the NHS and the local government authority among those that do have the power to sort of take people's pensions away from them or reduce them if they're convicted of wrongdoing. And so certainly I think if people want to sort of look at this and say, well, it shouldn't be one rule for them and another for other public sector workers, they will feel that frustration. There's also, I think, a sense that some MPs think they're untouchable and that kind of once they've left office, well, if the voters turf them out, that's it. Actually, this would be a really good reminder to a lot of MPs that if they do misbehave when they're in Parliament, there are consequences beyond just the 5 years.
Aubrey Allegretti, thank you very much indeed for your opinions on today's newspapers. Lovely to see you in the studio. Thank you.